Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Lee Halliday here. Today I've got a video that won't be too long, and what we are going to do is take a small React app that is using the Apollo GraphQL code. Specifically, it's configured the client using Apollo Boost, and we are going to refactor that and set up the client ourselves without using Apollo Boost. And that is a little bit more work, but it gives us more control over how the client performs. And later it gives us the ability to add in some pretty cool stuff around Apollo Link State and Apollo Link Rest, which I'll be covering in another video. So if you look at the screen here, we reload it, it's loading for a sec, and then it shows me the starred repositories I have. In this video, I'm not going to go over how that was built really, because specifically here, we're interested in how to configure Apollo Client. So if I just start in the app controller here, I've got my Apollo provider providing that context for the rest of my React app, and I've passed in a client. So that client here is being imported from Apollo Client, and here we can see that currently we are using Apollo Boost for this. So Apollo Boost is a fantastic library provided by Apollo, which basically helps you get up and running and configuring your Apollo client, and I would say it works well for most use cases, and that's why they built it. And as you're going to see at the end, it's a heck of a lot less code than configuring everything yourself. But sometimes you do need to stop using Apollo Boost to get a little bit more control over what happens in different situations. So let's get started converting this over to configuring everything ourselves. First thing I'm going to do is just remove Apollo Boost from my package.json, and I'm going to go to the command line and add a bunch of libraries in. So we are going to yarn add, and there's like 6 of them, so get prepared. We're going to do Apollo cache in memory. Then we're going to do Apollo client, and I'm going to go over later on what these all do. We've got Apollo link, we've got Apollo link HTTP, we've got Apollo link error, and we've got Apollo link context, and I think that's all of them. So let's add those in. Sort of crazy, no? You can see now why people use Apollo Boost, but anyways. So I'm just going to start this thing, even though it's going to be failing right now because we don't have Apollo Boost in our node modules, but let's get started. So we'll come into the client, and we can just delete this line because it's no longer being used. And I'm going to comment this out so I can copy and paste some stuff from it. So the first thing I'm going to import is in-memory cache from Apollo cache in memory. And what this does is it basically, when Apollo goes and fetches some data, it stores it in a data store. And that's because if you request the same information that it already has in the data store, it doesn't need to make a new GraphQL API request. It can just pull it from cache instead. So it's pretty useful. And this is the default one that comes with Apollo Boost, and it basically just stores everything in memory. So there's other cache stores you can use. Especially if you're on React Native, I don't think this one even works there, but this is the one we'll use on the web. So what we want to do is create cache, which will just be a new in-memory cache. So nothing too fancy going on. And on to the next library. The next library we are going to do is the Apollo client itself. So we're going to import Apollo client from Apollo client like that. So this is the actual client that sort of controls everything, that you pass all your configuration to, and handles the whole flow of communicating with between your front end code in React and the server or wherever you're loading your data from. So we'll create a client. We'll just do it down here, and it will be equal to a new Apollo client. And we're going to pass it a couple things. One thing we're going to pass is the cache. So here's where you can control what sort of cache our Apollo client uses. So we're pulling it up here from in-memory cache. The next thing we are going to need to pass to our client is something called a link. So I'll start importing it, and as I'm doing that, I'll explain what it's doing. So we are going to import Apollo link. Like that. And down here, we're going to call Apollo link.from. Like this. So what is link, what is Apollo link, and what is this from function? Basically, what Apollo link allows you to do is chain together a number of different, think of them as like function calls or middleware if you're used to that in Express or Ruby on Rails or whatever. And allows you to see the request as it's going through these links, and you can modify it. You can halt the request and pull the data from cache, or you can log errors, and you can do some different things with the GraphQL query or mutation that you're performing. So in this array, we are going to pass a few different Apollo links to handle different aspects of our requests. So the first one we are going to do is the Apollo, what is it called? Sometimes I forget this thing. The HTTP link from Apollo link HTTP. Cool. So this is the link that typically is going to be the last thing in your array, because I believe it's what's called a terminating link. And that's because when it goes through your links and it hits this one, this is when it actually goes out to the internet and performs the GraphQL API request. And then, so you can't put anything after this because it's not going to ever arrive to that link. So let's create a new HTTP link here, which will be a new HTTP link. And here is where we will pass the URI, which URL or URI to make the GraphQL requests to. So that's why I kept this code up here, because I can just come up here and copy that. And then I can add this HTTP link into our Apollo link from array. So we got two more links that we are going to add into this array. The next one we are going to do is on error. So this is Apollo link error. And this is a link that if an error happens sort of in your request, you can capture it and you can notify your bug tracker, or you can log it to the console if you're just in development mode. So it's a pretty handy error to deal with anything related to errors in your request. So I'll put this here. So error link equals on error. So what you pass this function is a function. So we'll do an arrow function here. And it receives an object that we can destructure. So I wrote this down because who's going to remember all this stuff? So the first one we can destructure out is GraphQL errors. And these are errors relating specifically to your GraphQL query or mutation. We have network error. So this would be an error like if it can't resolve this URL or whatnot. And it's just like a network layer error. And the next one is the operation. And we can use this to grab some additional information about what query or mutation we're performing. So before I even fill in this function, I'm just going to add the error link down here at the beginning so that it's there before it starts any of the other links that we are going to use. Because basically when Apollo client performs a request, it starts on like the left and it goes this one, terminates. Now it goes back through this one and then back out to whoever requested it. It's a chain of links. So what we can do here is we can say if there are any GraphQL errors, what we want to do is loop through them. So that will be an arrow function. And what we can strip off here is the message and the path of this error. So if I come into here, I can just, for now, console.log. This is where you might want to notify Bugsnag or whoever you're using to track your errors. So we'll just say that there was a GraphQL error, if I could spell, and the message was message, and the path, put a nice comma there, and the path was path. Cool, so we've handled that. Let's handle network now. So if there were any network errors, we'll just console.log that out. So it's a little bit longer, I think. Okay, so what we want to do is we'll say we had a network error, and specifically we will say we'll access the network error dot message, and then we'll say that what operation it occurred on. So operation name. So I'll trigger these so you can actually see what's happening. Just save this and it prettier does its thing. And that's it for that link, and we've already added it to our chain, so nothing left to do. The last link we are going to use will be the set context link from Apollo link context. Cool. And if you remember when we used Apollo Boost, we had to pass this request option where we pass an arrow function, and every time it's called, it would access the operation and set the context. And in this case, we're setting some headers to be sent along with the request so that GitHub knows what our authorization token is. So that's what we're going to be using set context for. So I'll add that here, and this will be called we'll call it the auth link because that's what we're going to be doing with it. So set context receives an arrow function, well, any function, but we'll do arrow. And the first parameter it receives is the context. We don't need that here, so we're just actually going to, oh, sorry, was it? Too many. Oh, sorry, the operation. We don't need access to that. We do need the context, which is the second one. So what we're going to do here is we're going to strip off the headers, and then whatever other properties are in this object that's being passed as the second parameter. So what we can do here is we can create our new context based on the old one. So we'll say context is equal to an object where we'll put in those rest that we stripped off. Then we're going to set some headers. First thing we're going to do is pass in all the previous headers that came to us when this set context function was called. And we will add a new header, which will simply come up here, and we'll copy this one that we were using in Apollo Boost. Like that. So what the key here is you just want to return that new context object. Before I take this auth link and put it down, well, why don't we just do that? Cool. So now our Apollo link has 3 links in its chain. First one is the error link, the auth link, which handles setting this authorization header, and then the HTTP link, which makes the actual HTTP request to GitHub's GraphQL API. So this was a little bit of a simple one here. We had the value right away so we could return the new context. You can also return a promise. So then as soon as that promise resolves, it will complete the operation. But what that allows you to do is, say you had you needed to make a request to fetch the token or something like that. It wasn't accessible right away. You can return a promise, and when that promise resolves, you can return that. So I think this is it. Let's load the page and see. There we go. So we got the same functionality working that we used to have with Apollo Boost, except we've done all of the configuration ourselves. So let me just remove that and I'll quickly review. We've got the cache. This is where Apollo stores its data as it's making different requests, and it's normalizing the data that's in the cache so that if you request the username and you already happen to have the username, it doesn't need to go make that request. It can just pull from the cache. We've got the error link, which allows us to log errors as they occur. We've got the auth link, which allows us to intercept the headers before they go out and add in one additional one here, the authorization header that GitHub requires to be authenticated. Last, we got our HTTP link, which is the one that makes the actual request. And then we use all of those things to create a client, passing in the cache, and then our link that we're going to be using, which is made up of those three other links. So as I mentioned, there are other links you can use that we haven't used yet, namely link state. You can actually use Apollo in place of something like Redux or MobX or even setState, so that you can access your local state the same way you would making a GraphQL API request. And there's link REST, which allows you to make RESTful API calls, but treat it as if you were requesting from GraphQL. Those are probably the next 2 videos I'm going to be doing, so subscribe if you're interested in those, and they'll be coming down the next couple of days. So it's working, but let's just make sure that our errors are working. So let's try to trigger one of these GraphQL errors. The quickest way you can do that is just by changing your GraphQL query to something that is invalid. So there's no tarred repositories. So a couple things happening here. First thing is we did get this error that I logged the console. Just make that a little bigger. So GraphQL error, the message is that the field tarred repositories doesn't exist on user. The path was undefined, so maybe I messed that up or something like that. Let's see, path. Maybe it's from something else. So we will troubleshoot. Here we go. No, maybe there just isn't one for this. So let's stick with it. I think it's okay because it looks like I'm doing the same thing that they are doing here. One thing we could add is the locations and see if that shows up. So that's an object, so we would have to stringify that if we wanted to see what was inside of that. Okay, reload it again. So this just tells you what line the error occurred on. But anyways, we at least know that it's logging the errors, and this would be handy to send to Bugsnag, as I mentioned before. But you obviously don't want this massive error in your React code. So the way you can solve that is by going to where it makes the request. And already we are showing this loading span if it's currently loading. But another thing we can access from this object being passed here is an error. So then we can just say, if there's an error, maybe we'll return another span. Sorry, error occurred. We are aware. So now it won't show that big React error. It will just catch that error here and display that. So let's trigger the other type of error, the network one. So you can see it's working again. We'll trigger that by coming down and let's just take off our authorization header. So that allowed us to see the authorization error. So network error, it failed to fetch. The operation we were performing was the start repos query. Another one might be that you mess up the URI. So same thing, network error 404 on the same query. So that'll help you troubleshoot the errors and also trap them so that the user doesn't see them. So that's it for this video. As I mentioned, please subscribe if you're interested in seeing a couple videos coming up about Apollo link state and Apollo link rest. Hope you have a great day. Take care. Bye.